Okay, this is our lesson on human well-being. I'm going to talk through what human well-being is, why it can be tricky to define, what our individual well-being is and how that might contribute to overall human well-being. And then we're going to look at how geographers actually measure well-being, the kinds of data that they use in order to make judgments about well-being around the world. So human well-being refers to the quality of life that people experience. That's the running definition we're going to use. I had a hunt around for lots of different definitions, and you guys know how picky I am about definitions, and I was not 100% satisfied with any of the definitions that I found online or in books. This is the closest thing that I've got to it, and I don't think it's perfect. I don't really like grammatically how it sits, that it's just human well-being refers to quality of life, but it's the simplest one that I could come up with that isn't misleading. So I guess you can consider that you could use the term human well-being interchangeably with the term quality of life. And some of the trickiness of using the term quality of life in a sentence is the same trickiness that you're going to face when trying to use human well-being in a sentence. So let's explore that a little bit. Firstly, we hardly ever use the term human well-being when we're talking about an individual. So when we say human well-being, we're usually just talking about whole populations of people. But that doesn't mean that your individual well-being isn't important or a contributing factor to overall human well-being. It is, and we're going to talk about that in a little while. But just so that we're clear, if we were talking about an individual, we would use that person's name. So we would say Mrs. Gray's well-being. We wouldn't say Mrs. Gray's human well-being. So it's like the word human just replaces the individual's name in that sentence. And so if you hear someone, a geographer, saying that they were going to try and measure human well-being in Sydney, you would be right to assume that that meant that they were going to try and measure the quality of life for many or all people living in Sydney, not just one or two people living in Sydney. The other reason why it's tricky to use the term human well-being in a sentence is because it's human well-being, which is inherently positive. You can hear that in the term. So it's not human unwell-being or just human being, it's human well-being. So the closest kind of equivalent word that I could think of that you guys might feel comfortable using in a sentence would be a term like health. So we don't have a word called unhealth, we just have health. It's inherently positive by nature, that's just the way the word functions. So even though we say that you can be unhealthy, we don't say you have unhealth. You just have little or poor health, if that makes sense. So health is here, and then if you're lacking in it in some way, that makes you unhealthy. And in a similar way, we would say that you have well-being, and then that's a positive metric. And then if it's lacking in some way, then we wouldn't even say you're unwell. We would just say that you have that there's poor human well-being, or that you as an individual have poor well-being. Even that kind of sounds clunky. It's tricky to explain. Let's talk about at least what human well-being is made up of. So in this section, we're going to dip into individual well-being, which is something that you would have covered probably already in PDHPE or perhaps science. So let's have a look at what you probably already know, just to recap. So this is your personal well-being and health. So not human well-being, but your individual personal well-being and health. Here are some of the factors that contribute to you having a high quality of life, I suppose, your personal well-being. So there's your physical health, which you're familiar with. So your nutrition, your sleep, the fact that your body is free from disease and drug use, etc. Your mental health, so that's your self-esteem, your self-belief, your ability to cope with stress, having kind of a stable mood. Your social relationships are also really important factors in improving your well-being. So that's the closeness and trustworthiness of your friends and family relationships, having a sense of belonging to other people and to place. Your work and hobbies are actually highly important for your well-being as well. Even though that might seem counterintuitive, you might think there's nothing better than when I'm on holidays and I don't have any work to do. But certainly being intellectually stimulated, having a feeling of being able to set goals and meet them and improving is really important psychologically for you as well. Your spiritual life is obviously very important. We spend a long time talking about that at school. A lot of your time when we pray together, that's also a well-being strategy. So definitely your relationship with God and a connection to something outside of yourself, a sense of justice and order in the world, life's purpose, all of those things contribute as well to your personal well-being. And finally, at a societal level, access and empowerment. So the idea that you live in a fair society, that your rights are met through law and through culture as well, that you have a voice, that you are empowered, that you can pursue some of your goals, and also that you functionally have enough money to meet all of these other needs as well that we've just spoken about. So that's your individual well-being and health, what some of the things that make that up. Let's talk about human well-being though, because with this term we're talking about a whole population. So how could we measure human well-being, aka large groups of people, for instance, the whole of Australia? How would we know that there is a good quality of life for everyone? Here's one approach. We could ask every single person in the country about their individual well-being. So we could ask them to report on all of those 6 factors that we just discussed. But I'm hoping that you're twigging that might be quite a complicated process and kind of difficult to do, and also somehow a little bit unreliable as well. There might be some problems with doing that. So I guess that leads us to going, well, there must be another way. Surely there's an easier way than just asking every single person to report on every single thing in their life, because that is really tricky. So yes, the answer is there are other sources of data that geographers use, and these are 3 that we're going to focus on today in this lesson. So here are some examples of what they are. The first one is called the Human Development Index, which is a score basically for countries based on average income, life expectancy, and education levels. The second one is gross domestic product per capita, and we'll go through that term again. It's a tricky term. You've probably not heard it before, but welcome to beginners economics. And the third one is the World Happiness Report, which sounds a lot more straightforward and is based on survey data. So that is that sense of trying to interview people and using questionnaires and getting them to report on their perceptions of their own quality of life. So they're the 3 that we're going to focus on today. Let's go through them one at a time and just talk about how they work and how the scoring works, and I guess some of the problems with them or benefits of them as well as we go. Before we do that, I'd just like you to write in your books this little summary. So I just get you to pause the screen right here and then write this down in your book. Okay, firstly, let's talk about the Human Development Index, otherwise known as HDI. That's the acronym for it. Basically, the Human Development Index is a system of scoring human development or human progress. And we mean that in the way that you might say there's a developed country and a developing country, that they're on different scales of economic progress, and the goal is basically to be developed. So this is a system of scoring human development created by the United Nations Development Programme, fittingly named. And the HDI scores are released every year as part of their kind of annual report. So this is a specific part of the United Nations that is dedicated to assessing and promoting human wellbeing around the world. So basically the way that the HDI score works is it's an index. So it's Human Development Index. And what an index is, it's a number given, a single number, like a score, that represents lots of other numbers. So represents lots of other data. And you might think, well, why have just one score? If there's all these different things being measured, like why bring it all together in one score? And basically the reason for that is that people like to rank stuff. Like human beings, we love to know if we're 1st in the world or 7th in the world overall. So basically that's why it's an index and why it's a single number. But that number is based on a collection of other numbers and other scores, if you will. The way that it works is it's a scale between 0 and 1. So 1 kind of signifies 100%, and nobody gets 1, basically, but the goal is to get as close to 1 as possible. So every score will be something like 0 point something. And you just want to get as high as possible, as close to 1 as possible. The higher your score is, the more developed the country is, and the greater the well-being is for people in that country. That's the thinking behind it. There are 4 different data sets that contribute to making that single number, that index, and they are life expectancy at birth, measured in years, expected years of schooling, measured in years, average actual years of schooling, measured in years, and gross national income per capita, which is not exactly the same thing as gross domestic product per capita, but they're similar enough, and we're going to spend a little bit more time unpacking what gross domestic product is per capita later. So don't worry if you don't know what that is. Hopefully the other 3, though, are fairly straightforward to you. Here's just an example of what the Human Development Index and its components actually look like. So this is an excerpt from the 2014 report. So as you can see here, we've got the rankings down the side, and as you may or may not have expected, Australia ranks really well against the world in lots of these factors. So in 2014, we were ranked number 2 in the world as having very high human development. So here you can see that this is the overall score, this is the index here, and then these are the little subsets that make up that composite score. So you've got life expectancy at birth, expected years of schooling, mean years of schooling. So mean, as you remember, is average, and then years of schooling. It's just important to note that this is an actual piece of data. And finally, gross national income per capita. There's another one here, which is basically a calculation that's run once these 4 data sets are calculated. And so that's like a 5th component that contributes to the overall score, but it's not a new piece of data, if that makes sense. So it's a calculation of the gross national income, which is this data set, minus the HDI rank, which is this number here. Okay, so again, I'm just going to get you to pause and write down these notes as a summary of what the Human Development Index is. The second, I guess, data set that geographers might use to infer or make judgments about the well-being of humans in a particular place is gross domestic product per capita. And gross domestic product is, again, quite a common acronym, GDP. So you might have heard that on the radio being said. Basically, what it means is a country's total monetary value. So that's what it means, what the terms actually mean. So that term domestic indicates country or national. The term gross indicates total, and product in this case means monetary value. So that's what it basically means. And then that little tack on there, per capita, you've probably used the word per before to mean divided by or according to or for, and then capita actually translates, basically if you look at the etymology of the word, translates to head, so each head, so that idea of per head. So that's what it basically means, is total monetary value of everything in the country, basically, divided by or per person is what it actually means. So you don't really need to know this, but it feels weird to not tell you anything about GDP, because I'm sure you have lots of questions about how on earth this is possibly calculated, like what the total monetary value of a country is. But this, so I'm going to put it here, but these words might not make any sense to you, and that's totally fine. Basically, GDP is the monetary value of private consumption, which, like your private consumption, you as an individual, what you purchase, that's what private consumption is, plus gross investment of the country, plus government investment, plus government spending, plus exports minus imports. So again, you don't really need to know this. It's pretty much just entry-level economic stuff, which might go right over your head, and that's totally fine. But what you can remember, and the reason why I'm putting this there, is so that you're not just picturing just cash. It's not just people sitting around adding up the dollars that are in their bank account to make up GDP. It's not that at all, actually. It's much more to do with a country's businesses, goods and services, the value of all of those businesses and all of those resources and services that are being provided. And yeah, it's the monetary value of that. So secondly, I'd just like you to write in your books this little summary of what GDP per capita actually is as well. Let's move on to the third data source here that geographers might use, again, to infer what human well-being is like around the world. And this one is called the World Happiness Report. Basically, it's, again, the team of researchers that call themselves the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, also affiliated with the United Nations, which is the same organization that's putting out the HDI score as part of their annual report. So this is a second report that deals with similar content, but you'll see that the methodology, the way that they actually gather the data, is quite different. So the HDI is based on some kind of objective measures. So it's based on that gross national income per capita. It's based on some objective data about, you know, years at school, for instance, and life expectancy. They're kind of set in stone pieces of data. This one is a subjective test. So we're asking people through surveying basically how they perceive their quality of life to be. So you might think, oh, that's way more unreliable than looking at numbers. And that's fine. That might be your personal preference, that, you know, asking people what they think and what they feel is so much more unreliable. But remember here that the goal is to measure happiness. So the alternative is to just say things like, people in this country are rich, therefore they're happy. And we also know that that's not necessarily true. So it depends on the way that you measure the validity of the data. Because we're measuring something that is subjective, like happiness, it's perfectly valid to ask people how they feel about their own happiness. So that's what this is. So you'll see that here there are some similar categories to what we find in the HDI. GDP per capita has cropped up again here. Healthy life expectancy has cropped up here. We've got a few different ones here. Some questions related to personal freedoms, how they feel about government, how they feel about generosity of spirit of other people that they're living alongside. So fellow people in their country, basically. And yeah, and it's all based on survey data. So it's just how people feel about these things. And because of that, I think it's a really fascinating report, actually. And I just wanted to include this little excerpt from the commentary. Like, this is the frequently asked questions page that kind of accompanies the report. You can find this online. It's really interesting reading. It's very long, but it's very interesting reading. This is just one excerpt that I thought would be good to have a look at. So I'm just going to skim and read it for you here. It says, the rankings in figure 2.1, and figure 2.1 is the kind of like overall rankings figure, are based on answers to the main life evaluation questions asked in the poll. So if you were wondering, oh, what kind of questions would I be answering if I was going to be included as a survey respondent in this data, here it gives you a little bit of an idea. And basically the way you would respond is against something called a Cantrell ladder. So the question would ask you to think of a ladder, to imagine a ladder in your mind, and the best possible life for yourself is a 10, and the worst possible life is a 0. And then you're asked to rate your own life on that 1 to 10 scale with a bunch of questions about different aspects of your life. So that's the way that it would work. The factors that are kind of included are levels of GDP, life expectancy, generosity, social support, freedom, and corruption. Ooh. And just so you know, the goal is to make the data a bit clearer. They want all of the, they don't want there to be any minus scores. So all of the scores are positive. And so the way that they do that to make the numbers a lot easier to crunch is to come up with this hypothetical dystopia, they've called it, as you can see there. So it's not a real country. It's just an imaginary country. You imagine a place that's zero on everything. And then you're comparing your state of living to this dystopia. And it's not possible that your actual state of living could be worse than dystopia. And that's a way of just keeping the numbers clean and whole and positive numbers. In response to this report being released this year, this is kind of a really interesting article that was published in the New York Times, which I stumbled across. And basically people are very curious about how the happiness report will look in light of the coronavirus pandemic. So this is one of the researchers, Professor Sachs, and he is quoted a couple of times in this little excerpt. Again, I just wanted to show you just a piece of this article because I think it's really fascinating and some of the insights that have come out of it. This is the New York Times, so it's definitely like an American writer who's thinking particularly about the US and how the results coming from the US might be different. But this is what Professor Sachs has to say. He says that a loss of faith in institutions has dovetailed with the drop in happiness. So what he's observing there is a correlation between how confident I feel in the government to take care of me equals how happy I am. He says those two things go together. So he believes that because people feel less confident in the government to take care of them, that as a result, they're less happy. And that has particularly come to light because of the coronavirus pandemic, where that faith is being really tested, as he says. And this idea that we're all in this together. So it's almost like Professor Sachs is observing that one of the key ingredients for people feeling happy is to feel like the other people that they're living alongside, like your fellow Australians, somewhat have your back and are going to do the right thing. And that's certainly how people in Finland seem to be feeling. So it says in Finland, 91% of the survey responders reported being satisfied with their president. It's a big one. And 86% said that they trust the police. And so here we go. Frank Martella, a Finnish philosopher who contributed to the report, said every time the president or the prime minister holds a public speech about the issue, the overwhelming response is one of trust and commitment. So that's in Finland. People actually really trust the government. And not only do they trust the government, they actually trust their kind of fellow people to do the right thing, to follow instructions, that everyone will do their part to control the spread of this virus. And that's part of the reason that these researchers feel the Finns are more happy than Americans are. So I just thought that was really interesting, the idea that we all kind of need each other, and that my personal happiness is not just about how much stuff I have and how comfortable my life is, but it's also about how much I trust the people who are in authority over me and how much I trust my neighbors and my friends to be doing the right thing in a situation such as this. It's very topical and relevant at the moment. So again, pause your video here and you can just write down these notes to summarize what the World Happiness Report is all about. Okay, finally, just to wrap this video up, I did just want to bring this map to your attention because overall, if you were to take something like the Human Development Index, which is one of these metrics that geographers use to measure human well-being, and you were to map it up like this is a kind of pseudo choropleth map. We've got a color chart here that shows usually choropleth maps show the density of something. In this case, density is a bit of a clunky way to look at it, but the amount of something, and we've got the amount of human development. And remember that that's the goal. We want high human development. High human development equals, according to these measures, high levels of human well-being. So it's pretty much the usual suspects. The countries, the continents that are doing well here are maybe what you would be expecting. That's the richest countries in the world in a lot of respects. So we've got North America, Europe, Australia, and some parts of South America doing really, really well here, right down to a considerable portion of Africa with very low human development. And we infer from that low human well-being. So it's time now for you to check your understanding. So there'll be a Google form posted and you can follow the instructions on the LMS to complete that. just to test what you've learned throughout this little lesson. Thanks for listening. And if you have any more questions, make sure that you ask your geography teacher, and also just do your own research online. This is a fascinating subject and there's lots and lots of articles out there and information for you to find.